Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks and these are the top headlines of this Monday. President Zelensky says that victories in Ukraine and the recent recapture of Kherson from Russia have exacted a high price. He spoke during a surprise visit to the recaptured southern city. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says Ukraine faces difficult months ahead and that Russia's military capabilities should not be underestimated. French officials say President Emmanuel Macron will call on counterpart Vladimir Putin after the G20 summit in Bali. Macron has maintained lines of communication with the Russian leader despite the conflict in Ukraine, and officials say the two men will continue to talk. After the Turkish government blamed the PKK for the weekend's Istanbul bomb attack, the Kurdish militant group is denying it played a role. One Syrian woman has been accused of planting the explosive device that killed 6 people. Iran claims it has evidence of a foreign role in the country's riots. It says it's provided that evidence to countries whose nationals it claims participated in unrest that has rocked the country in recent weeks. Afghanistan's supreme leader orders judges to enforce fully aspects of Islamic law that include public executions, stonings and floggings, and the amputation of limbs of thieves. We begin here in the United States, where the Democrats are celebrating their U.S. Senate win, while the Republicans are worrying about the future of their political party. President Biden heard over the weekend that the Democrats had retained control of the U.S. Senate, an outcome from America's midterm elections that seemed impossible just a few months ago. A massive boost for Joe Biden as he heads into the final 2 years of what he still hopes will be just his first term in the presidency. The future of the U.S. House of Representatives still hangs in the balance. Democrats are considered unlikely to retain their control there, but any Republican majority in the House will be as thin as a wafer. Controlling the Senate, of course, gives Democrats the power to reject legislation that is sent to the Senate by a Republican-controlled House, but only, of course, if the Democrats are able to remain united. And that has, in recent months, been a complicated challenge for Joe Biden's White House. Meanwhile, after failing to mobilize the red wave of Republican support that he had promised, former President Donald Trump is still going ahead with his announcement of a fresh bid for the presidency in 2024. Tuesday night, Mar-a-Lago in Florida will be the scene of that speech by Trump after his aides and advisors failed in their quest to talk him out of making it. Over the weekend, a growing number of Republicans tried to sideline Trump after the discouraging election outcomes for Republicans, and clear evidence that voters are rejecting more extreme Trump-backed candidates all over the country. Many Republican donors and operatives are already shifting their support to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He has kept Trump at arm's length and won his own re-election battle with a whopping 60% of the vote in the Sunshine State. For more on all of this, I'm joined now by WION's US correspondent Susan Tehrani, who is with us live from New York. Susan, let's start with Donald Trump. Why is he going ahead with this announcement? What does he think is to be gained by making this announcement at a time when every other potential presidential candidate is sitting there sifting through the election results, going through the trove of voter data that they have delivered and trying to understand precisely where the country currently now stands?
So for whatever reason, Donald Trump thinks that he did not really play a critical role for the Republicans not having that so-called red wave. He actually said that he was happy with the outcome. And on the other hand, Donald Trump right now is the only Republican, sort of Republican leader, if you may, that is sitting on so much amount of money and cash because of donations and campaign donations that he chose to keep and not spend on the candidates that he endorsed, that he thinks that he's in a good position to run. And to make this announcement. He also believes that despite the fact that now there are many alternatives to him in terms of being the leader of the Republican Party, none of them have really ran a national election. So these are some of the reasons perhaps that Donald Trump is thinking it's a good idea for him to announce a presidential bid Tuesday, which is tomorrow here in the United States. However, as we've talked about time and again, the Republican Party right now has a lot of soul searching to do. There are questions on whether or not they want Donald Trump as their leader. But one thing is for sure, he's still extremely powerful. Whether he is effective, that's the bigger question right now.
So let's switch over to the Democrats, Susan, and Joe Biden, reanimated by these midterm election results and presumably reanimated in the possibility of him seeking a second term in office, which must send a complicated message to the younger generation of Democrats salivating for their opportunity to run for the presidency.
Yeah, it's interesting because 2024 seems very close and everyone is gearing up for it, but it's still 2 years away on the one hand. And we'll have to wait and see whether or not Joe Biden has the stamina to really get on that stage and start debating and running, and whether or not the Democrats really want Joe Biden to run. But then the question remains if, for example, there is no Donald Trump in 2024, and Joe Biden was the only viable candidate to beat Donald Trump in 2024, then would the Democrats look elsewhere for a so-called younger candidate or move towards, dare I say, Kamala Harris for an alternative to Joe Biden? But right now, yes, he seems emboldened. The Democrats seem like they're even talking about a quote-unquote blue wave in 2024. I wouldn't go that far as saying that. But they think that, they've got the upper hand right now. But still, 2 years away, a lot could happen in 2 years.
One election just over, another one just beginning. Susan Tehrani, WION's US correspondent, live from the streets of New York. Thanks very much indeed for that. To Bali now, where the world's attention is on that high-stakes meeting between President Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. They met face-to-face as presidents of their respective countries for the first time. Their bilateral meeting beginning with a friendly handshake, followed by talks that aimed at finding a way out of the frosty relationship between Washington and Beijing and propelling it onto a more positive path.
Committed to keeping the lines of communications open between you and me personally, but our governments across the board. because our two countries have so much that we have an opportunity to deal with.
The current situation that China-US relationship is facing is a concern for all of us. The situation is not in line with the interest of the people of our two countries, nor does it satisfy the expectations of the international society.
Now, those talks between the two leaders lasted almost exactly 3 hours and ended within the last half an hour or so. Earlier in the day, Biden and Xi arrived in Bali for the G20 summit, which of course begins on Tuesday. But today was set aside for their meeting. And China was saying ahead of the meeting that it hoped to bring relations back on track with the US at the summit, while Biden told Asian leaders in Cambodia over the weekend that America's communication lines with China will stay open to prevent conflict. Both leaders talked of seeking to manage competition responsibly and work together where their interests align. But from the chip market to Ukraine, Taiwan and human rights, divisions have only deepened in the last year. President Xi's government on multiple occasions has criticised the Biden administration's posture towards self-ruled Taiwan, which Beijing considers its own territory. It views US recent action in the region as undermining China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Biden and Xi have held 5 calls since Biden became US president in January of 2021. The last time they met face-to-face was during the Obama presidency, when Joe Biden, of course, was vice president. So for more on how this meeting went, I'm joined now by WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. He is live for us from Bali. And Siddhant, I'm seeing a White House readout of this meeting that says the two leaders spoke candidly about their respective priorities and intentions across a range of issues. What else do we know about how this meeting went?
Well, the meeting, of course, lasted for considerable time, and from the White House readout, which is considerably long, it looks like that it's a positive meeting. In fact, the last line of that readout says that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be traveling to China for the follow-up of the conversations that happened here in Bali. So that's a significant development. The United States sending the Secretary of State to Beijing. That shows that there is some kind of easing of the thorny issues, or perhaps the tiff that had happened between Washington and Beijing, especially after the Taiwan Strait crisis, where we saw both sides coming up with strong rhetoric. But by and large, today's meeting could essentially go a long way in terms of pacifying or easing the tensions between the world's number 1 and number 2 economy. There were many issues, Taiwan issue, trade issues. In fact, the readout also mentions about trading issues. The US president also raised issues like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, of course, naturally, and of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That all has been mentioned in the readout. But now the big focus is on the presser by the US president shortly happening here in Bali.
Siddhant, it's worth making the point that in that readout, the Americans say that President Biden and President Xi reiterated their agreement that a nuclear war should never be fought and can never be won, and underscored their opposition to the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That is the Americans driving at least a small wedge between Beijing and Moscow, right?
Well, yes, of course, and this is a message straight to Moscow, that too by Washington and Beijing, and perhaps the sharpest criticism, to use the phrase, from Beijing of the rhetoric coming from Moscow by the Russian President Vladimir Putin regarding the usage of nuclear weapons. So that clearly shows that Beijing is also not very happy, given that the rhetoric and of course the commentary coming from the Russian president. And remember, Beijing and Russia, Moscow have good relationships, so much so the phrase was used as the limitless partnership. That limitless partnership looks like is heading towards some limits, and these comments are something that Moscow surely will be carefully reading.
And just finally and briefly, Siddhant, you pointed out that sort of the key deliverable coming out of this meeting appears to be this agreement that Secretary of State Antony Blinken will visit China to follow up on the discussions. I mean, assuming that that outcome was not necessarily pre-cooked, and it may have been, what should we read into that? I mean, that they are at least agreeing that dialogue is the continuing way to go?
The fact that both the sides are willing to talk, and also the visit of a high-level official from Washington to Beijing, is a very positive outcome, given just few months ago or perhaps weeks ago there were shrilling comments coming from both sides, and it looked like the relationship is going towards some kind of disaster, but that it looks like is not happening as of now, and Bali could be seen as a major success in bringing back the relationship to a normalcy that was, of course, being also talked about. In fact, a lot of conciliatory comments were coming from the American side by the US president, who said that the competition should not lead to conflict, and also talked about certain red lines. But clearly there has been a candid conversation between the leaders of US and, of course, China.
Siddhant Sibal, WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, joining us live from Bali. And stay with WION, of course, for more dispatches from Siddhant as the G20 summit gets underway on Tuesday. Now, protests in Iran that started over the death in custody of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini for failing to wear her head covering correctly have spiraled into one of the biggest challenges ever faced by the country's Islamic rulers. As demonstrations near their 2-month anniversary, Iran has issued its first death sentence to a detained protester. His or her identity has not been disclosed. According to an online judiciary website, the convict set fire to a government building, disturbed public order, conspired to commit a crime against national security, and has proved to be an enemy of God. The death sentence opens a new phase of Iran's crackdown on protesters. Earlier this month, 272 of Iran's 290 lawmakers demanded that the judiciary apply the death penalty in some cases. They're calling it an eye for an eye approach. The protests started with a crackdown by Iran's morality police that the government called necessary in its quest to uphold Islamic values. Since then, more than 2,000 people have already been charged, about half of them in the capital, Tehran. The Norwegian-based NGO Iran Human Rights says at least 20 people are now facing charges punishable by the death sentence. Local media also report the judiciary has charged over 750 people across 3 provinces for their involvement in the riots. Western governments have imposed sanctions on Iran over the recent crackdown, on top of a barrage of other restrictions already in place against the country. Those taken together are crippling the Iranian economy. Iceland and Germany are now calling for a special session at the UN Human Rights Council over the situation. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Mexico City demonstrating against proposed electoral reform. They insist that the change will undermine the independent body that organises the country's elections. Protesters chanted "Hands off INE," that's the National Electoral Institute, as they made their way through the city centre. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has plans to overhaul the country's electoral commission. Under his proposal, the INE will be replaced by a new body with members chosen by voters instead of lawmakers. He says the reform will reduce the influence of economic interests in politics. However, the demonstrators argue it will give the president more control over the country's electoral system. The protest was attended by big names from Mexican politics, including former President Vicente Fox and the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies, Santiago Creel.
National Electoral Institute will not be touched. Hundreds of thousands of young people are here to battle to defend this institute that cost the lives of many people in the country. It's clear, it's not perfect, and of course we can improve it, but not with your authoritarian reform and wants to take an autonomous organ, an autonomous referee away from us.
We are here against the electoral reform that Morena party is proposing to destroy the Mexican democracy, to lead us to places such as Venezuela and Cuba. Please, Mexicans, wake up.
The proposal requires support from at least 2/3 of the lawmakers in Mexico's lower house. The proposed reform would also reduce the number of seats in the lower house of Congress from 500 to 300, and those in the Senate from 128 to 96. The proposal is expected to be discussed in Mexico's Congress in the coming weeks. After firing thousands of Twitter employees in only the first week of his takeover of the platform, billionaire Elon Musk is now removing a significant number of contract employees. Reports say that Twitter has dispensed with the services of around 5,000 contractors without providing any prior notice. The contractors realized they were removed when they lost access to the company's internal communications and even email. It's reported that some of these contract workers were based overseas in India, among other locations. Meanwhile, Twitter's new owner today said that he was working at the absolute most amount from morning till night, 7 days a week. While addressing a business conference by video link on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali, Musk added, "I have too much work on my plate."
Sorry, that works just weirdly.
Elon, I know you are a hard worker, but with a lot of headlines that you make lately, if I were you, I would, jump on a plane and fly to Bali and kind of like hike a little bit or relax. Why don't you do that?
I mean, that sounds fantastic. But my workload has recently increased quite a lot. I mean, oh man, I have too much work on my plate, that is for sure.
Just before our final story, one bit of breaking news. The New York Times reporting that the CIA director, William Burns, today met with his Russian counterpart in Turkey, where he warned Russia against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That news coming from a White House spokesman. CIA Director William Burns meeting today with his Russian counterpart specifically to warn Moscow against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Finally from us today, the multiple Grammy winner Taylor Swift has not only broken records with her new album Midnights, but has also now become a 10 on 10 girl on Billboard. And now the American singer has walked away with the top 4 prizes at MTV's Europe Music Awards. More on all of these exciting developments in our next report.
The winner of the Best Artist of the Year is Taylor Swift!
I'm so blown away. You have no idea how much it means to me to even get to do this as a career. There's not a single moment I take that for granted. I love you so much. I can't believe I get to do this as a job. It's all because of you. Thank you so, so much. I love you all so much. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
And that's all we've got time for on this edition of WION Live broadcast from Washington, D.C. I will be back at the same time, same place tomorrow with all the latest from the G20 summit in Bali, among other international developments. And between now and then, don't forget, stay tuned for all your news updates to WION. World is One.
There are many other